All right, welcome. I'm April Wolford. I'm the Zoom host here for your afternoon session. So I just want to let you know that we'll have your microphones muted through the first part of this conversation. And then when we get to the Q&A section, we'll unmute my microphones so that you can ask your questions directly. But feel free to post questions in the chat. If you have them, go ahead and post them in there. Susan Jennings, who's the MC, she'll field those questions in the chat session as you provide them. If you have any questions or technical issues, feel free to put that in the chat as well. Now I'm going to introduce Susan Jennings, who's the Executive Director of the Arthur Morgan Institute for Community Solutions. This is their 80th year of offering conferences like this. Susan, would you like to take it away?
Yes, I will. Thank you very much, April. And just if I could give a shout out to April, she is the person she's the rock star who's kept us all going this whole time. So thank you, April. I'm really thrilled to welcome Cindy Folck and Brad Bergefurd here to our afternoon session. They represent the two land grant institutions in Ohio. We're very lucky to have two land grant institutions. Cindy Folck actually has experience in both. She recently, or I guess in the last year, became the state lead for ag and natural resources at Central State University. She's already doing an amazing job. She's been reaching out far and wide and doing a lot of interesting work in our region. So if you happen to be lucky enough to live in our region, you should make sure you get her her contact info because she's doing great work. And Brad Bergefurd works for The Ohio State University. He is a specialty crop specialist in their extension service. And both of them are going to share a little bit about what's happening in the farming industry throughout the state of Ohio since the pandemic started. So Cindy, I think you're going to start us off.
Yes, so I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. So welcome everybody. So glad that you're all joining us, and I just need to have the host allow me to share the screen. So I'm excited that this conference has been happening, and thanks to any of you who might have been able to join us locally for the Central State tours last night. We had a few folks that came out. We were really glad to show things off, and we hope in the future we might be able to do some virtual ones too.
You should be set.
So it should work now? Okay. It does. Thank you.
Awesome.
Okay. So can everyone see the slides? Are they up? Okay, terrific. When Susan and the other folks who are putting together this conference talked to me about farming during the pandemic, Ariella Brown was another person I had talked with. There's really so many different commodities that were affected just between having supplies available, labor available. And so I'm going to kind of address the livestock part of it. And then Brad is a great specialist for specialty crop growers. And so he's going to address that other piece of it. We're not into some of the major commodities such as corn, wheat, and soybeans, but kind of talking about things that would affect more small farmers and things that they would be involved with in production. So I'm going to start us all off by talking about locally raised meat and some of the things that we saw during the pandemic, and then also kind of think about the future as we look forward to what farmers have experienced during the COVID, because the one thing is we know that things won't be the same. Even when we're back to what we consider normal, it's going to be a new normal. There's a few things that are going to linger that we've experienced, things that we've learned. And I think in the meat especially, it showed some vulnerabilities that we have for meat distribution, not only in Ohio, but also nationwide. So that's something we saw during the pandemic. The fact that we had some empty shelves, and we saw a spike in prices for meat for the general consumer. And when you think about meat production, the animals that are available in the grocery store now, they're already in the production system. So my husband and I raise pigs. I have some pigs that were just born last week. Those pigs are going to be going to market here. They'll be ready in the spring. So I already have them in the production and the distribution cycle. But what we saw that happened during the pandemic is we have a lot of our meat distribution that goes to some very large processors, and then we have some small processors, and we kind of don't have a lot of that middle. So if you kind of look at some of the numbers that we had, so back in May, the ability to process pork, for example, was down 40%. So this was not because there weren't pigs available to be processed. It was the fact that there was no place for the pigs to go to be processed. We had some of the big plants, especially out in Iowa, that had labor that tested positive for COVID. So they either had to reduce their shifts or close down completely. So this really disrupted the whole chain that we had for meat to make it from the farm to the consumer. And if you kind of look at this map that I have here, you can kind of see this is just looking at beef and pork production or processing. So I'm not considering poultry in this. So this was a map that was back in May, and you can see that the X's were the plants that were closed, and then the yellow were the plants that were partially shut down. So here in Ohio, we weren't affected as far as a closed plant. But the thing is, our processing in Ohio is not all of the pigs in Ohio are processed in Ohio. Most of our pigs go west. As you can see, there's no beef cattle processing in Ohio of any large size. So if you're producing a lot of cattle, they're not going to stay in Ohio. They're going elsewhere to be processed. So that meant Ohio didn't have control over conditions in those plants or anything. It was in another state. And as you can see, most of those plants are pretty well grouped here. This is Iowa, Kansas, Nebraska, South Dakota, Minnesota. Those are a lot of places where the processing happens. And so for consumers, when this, the one thing COVID did is kind of shine the light on where our meat is coming from. Even though it might be raised here in Ohio, the processing is happening someplace else. And so it started consumers really thinking about, well, where is my meat coming from? And so for local producers who just sell local and don't put it into the national distribution channels, they saw a huge increase in demand. But then what we found out was we don't have those medium-sized plants here. We just have small processors. So all those pigs couldn't stay in Ohio and get processed because there was no place to take them. So this really showed us through COVID the fact that we just don't have processing, especially in Ohio. There's quite a bit in Indiana and Michigan, but Ohio itself has very little processing capacity when it comes to livestock. So when we think about how people sell their livestock, it used to be you would take them down to the auction barn. Auction barns would be associated with a processor. But we really got away from this model because most of the auction barns were based on market prices. So if I took my animals in, if the prices were down that day, I just didn't get a good enough price. I couldn't plan on what my price was going to be because it was dependent simply on market forces. If you're a really large farm, you could get away from that fluctuation because you could have a buyer that would come, and if you had enough livestock to fill a semi-truck, you could get a better price. So the smaller growers were basically looking at auction barns with the market fluctuations, which increased their risk compared to a larger farm. And so a lot of livestock producers, I would say this started probably in the 80s, really gained steam in the 90s. And today, if you look across, especially in the poultry and pork production, most farmers have a contract. And what that does is that takes all the risk away from me as a producer on those market prices. And so the contract barns are basically where I have a company and they have a contract with me that they're going to have X number of pigs that are probably born on somebody else's farm that has a contract. So that farmer has the contract for those pigs to be born there. And then when they reach a certain size, they go to the next place. And then that's where they're fed out to the large market size. And then the company that I'm contracted with takes care of the processing. So what happened in COVID-19 is these contracted barns had no place for the pork to go. It also happened with chicken. When the processor was unable to accept them, they were stuck. That contract suddenly had that little clause in there that there was no place for it to be processed. And so as a result, livestock prices plummeted. So even though I wasn't a contracted barn, even if I was just raising them locally and selling them locally, my prices got influenced by this, because suddenly everyone with contract barns was trying to sell their meat locally rather than selling it to the national chain, because that national distribution channel got interrupted. So that's where we saw the shortages. It really wasn't because there wasn't any meat out there. It was just there was no place to process them. We had really big plants processing a lot of animals, and because they weren't there, those animals didn't have any place to go. So even now we still have some of the production is still backed up a little. And so for us smaller farmers, this is some of our pigs that we have. We had some pigs that were ready to go to market back in May, and we had so when you're working with a small custom processor, because they don't have a lot of space, you usually have to call ahead and get an appointment. So usually we think 2 months, when we know we've got some pigs that we're going to take in for some customers, we'll call, make the appointment for them to be processed. Now I have to call a year ahead because they're so booked up. Everything got backlogged. A lot of the producers that didn't have any place for the pigs to go or cattle to go are simply feeding them longer. And so that means a year from now, those are pigs that haven't even been born for me. For cattle producers, yes, they've been born, but knowing when you're going to have them and making sure you have your customers, this has really skewed how the production is gone. So this is something that we were vulnerable to. And in normal times, it wasn't anything that a lot of, it was problematic for some people that there's not a lot of capacity, but suddenly when we had just a little link in that chain go down, we realized that we just don't have capacity for processing some of the meat animals. So when we think about this capacity piece, so we realize that we have only really small processors, and then we have the really big processors. So, how's that going to kind of play out as we start thinking about how people are marketing meat? So we have consumers that want to buy more locally. So we have the potential that we have more people wanting to get into local meats. I mean, there's some that were doing contract aren't going to do contract anymore. They might decide that they want to go back to just locally raised, direct marketing to the consumer. So, another piece of why we don't have the capacity is some of the regulation that's around processing. So when I'm doing processing for customers, whether it's, and this covers beef cattle, sheep, goats, and pigs, I cannot slaughter anything on my farm and sell it to somebody. Everything has to go through an inspected processing. And so as you can imagine, the regulations for setting up a processing facility, there's a lot of things that have to happen. So it's not like we have this demand, so all of a sudden they're going to start popping up all over. This is something that has to be well planned. Somebody has to make a very large investment in order to have a processing facility. So as you market these different things, I have, the fact that not having a lot of processing space means as a producer, and part of my job at the extension is I'm working with new and beginning farmers. So if I have someone that's thinking about, okay, I want to, there's big demand for local meat, I want to start raising some. These are things that we have to start thinking about, is how are you going to market that? And is there really capacity in your area in order for you to do some of that marketing? So these are things that the pandemic kind of showed us that we need to pay attention to. because when and I thought I would put some numbers in just to kind of help you judge what you would consider a small processing unit versus large. So these are the big producers in the area, or big processors in the area. So the largest we have in Ohio is Ruth, which is in Sandusky. They're processing 4,200 head of pigs a day. That's considered a medium-sized packing plant. It's the only one in Ohio, however, it's pretty far north. Clemens is in Coldwater. They're doing 12,000 pigs a day. If I have beef cattle, the closest is JBS. They're up in the corner of Michigan, 1,250 a day. IBP is out in Joslin, and they're processing 3,100. So this kind of gives you an idea of the size of a large plant. So Ruth is really a medium-sized plant, and that's the only one that we have around. So even when you're considering, like, if a Kroger or somebody wanted to start doing more local meat offerings, there's really not any capacity to be able to support an Ohio brand in a Kroger because they have too many stores. We just don't have that capacity. So this is really something, as we start looking at the meat industry, is you have just a very few companies with very big plants, and then a lot of very small processors, and we're missing that middle. And that middle is where you can start having like retail supermarkets. Like if I wanted to start a branded pork products, or if somebody had like pasture raised beef and they wanted to have like 3 or 4 farmers form a co-op, to have this pasture raised beef, what's going to be their biggest stumbling block? Where are they going to get that processed? Because a small processor might not be able to handle the number of head they want to do a day to support their brand. But they certainly can't take it all the way out to Illinois for processing. So those are some things that I think have kind of stopped a lot of small regional cooperatives to start branding their products to offer to the consumer, especially in Ohio, because we just don't have that capacity to process the meat. So just to kind of cover what we do have here in Ohio. So the processing facilities in Ohio are licensed by the Ohio Department of Agriculture. So there's 3 tiers to processing. So if I just am selling a pig to someone and they're going to consume all of that pig, so they're not going to resell the meat at all, it's for their consumption, then I can use what's called a custom or a not for resale place. So that's a facility where the inspectors are not there all the time. It's inspected on a regular basis, but when the animals are being processed, it's not required for an inspector to be on time, be there, which means they're not paying that hourly rate for a state inspector to be there watching everything that's done. So it's less expensive. However, as a producer, that means I sell that pig to somebody and they get it processed. So I can't go to a farmer's market and sell roast. I can't go to have people come to my farm market and just buy some bacon. It has to be that customer takes it and then they take it home. So there's no resale potential in there. So a lot of people that want to do direct marketing of meat products have to go to more of a fully inspected level. So there's the state inspection and then there's USDA inspection. It used to be you would have to have USDA inspection if you wanted to sell the meat out of state. So if I I was right on the border of Ohio and Indiana, and I had some customers in Indiana that I wanted to resell to, maybe like a retail store that was going to carry my meat, then I would have to have USDA inspection. Ohio has now gotten the clearance that our regulations are tough enough that we're just as tough as the federal requirements. So they allow a processing unit that uses the state inspector to be able to sell across state lines. So what that means, if it's fully inspected, is when I'm doing the processing, so when the animal first comes in and is harvested, there's an inspector there watching every step. So that's the difference that you have. So that's it's a higher price because I have to pay for that inspector. It's not free. for that inspector to be there when I'm doing it. So if you think about capacity, to make it more economical for me, I'm going to make sure that I gang everybody at certain times when I'm doing that first processing, because I have to pay for the inspector to be there. So I might not do it every day, or I'm only doing it half the day, because I've got to account for that extra cost that I have there. So that's some of the regulations that kind of come in that might prevent somebody from building a bigger facility, because that means I need more inspection. Those are all things that have to be part of the business plan when you start thinking it through. There is an exemption for poultry in licensing. So like I said, it's beef, pork, lamb, and goat that you cannot slaughter on your farm. They have to go to a facility to be processed. The only time I can slaughter it on my farm is if my family is going to eat it. So they do not allow where if you buy the pig and you come to my farm, you buy the pig and you want to have me help you slaughter it on my farm, I can't. It's only for my family on my farm I can never let that animal leave my farm, basically. So there is an exemption for poultry. So if I have a flock of birds that's under 1,000, then I'm able to process and sell them off the farm. I can't take them someplace out to somebody else's farm and sell them off their farm. If I raised them, it has to be the farm where they were raised. So that's the exemption that poultry has. Otherwise, there are poultry processing. However, in Ohio, we have very little poultry processing that's not under contract. So for example, Cooper Farms or Gerber process their own birds, but it's only from farmers who are contracted with them to grow the birds. I can't just take my birds and put it into their system. So there's very few places where you can get poultry processed if you're going to have a little larger flock, or if you just don't want to process it on your farm. That's one limitation. Also, rabbits are something else that we do have some processing in Ohio, but very little where people are doing processing rabbits. The other thing that when I'm working with a producer that wants to do direct marketing of meat is, in addition to having to take my product to a processor who's fully licensed for resale, I also have to get additional licenses with my local health department if I'm going to sell it on the farm or if I'm going to sell it at farmers markets. This also covers online sales because it's what they call warehousing. So the fact that I go pick up the meat from the processor, because they're not going to hold it for me, I bring it back to the farm, and then I'm going to sell it for the rest of the summer at farmers markets. Well, when I'm not at farmers markets, all that meat has to be stored somewhere. And that's where the warehousing comes in. And so the local health department gets involved with whatever the rules are in that county. So it'd be rules for how I store it on the farm, and then rules for what I have to do when I take it out to the farmers market. Some of them require generators to keep a freezer going. Some of them require dry ice. There's, some different things depending on what county you're in. So that's an additional thing you have to think about when you're going to be taking it out to sell it. So kind of looking ahead, some of the opportunities and challenges we have is really, I think there's some potential because there's consumer demand for local meat, but I think we really need to encourage everyone, especially when we talk to legislators and as we work with producers, are we being fair in the regulation piece to make it beneficial, because we want to have food safety for the consumer, but we also want to make it an accessible market. So is regulation keeping people out of the market? There's some things we can do there. There's labor. In facilities, if we want to age, especially in beef, you want to age it. However, we get back to that thing, there's not that capacity. If they're a year out trying to get cattle through, they're not going to let a carcass hang very long in the cooler. And then because processing involves wastewater, we also have the environmental regulations that are involved. And then considerations for farmers, because it's not something where in 60 days I'm going to have something ready to go unless it's poultry, but beef cattle, it's a year. So there's a lot of logistics you have to consider if you're going to start marketing that way. And then also, when we consider some of the health departments, are they being consistent from county to county? Sometimes that doesn't happen. So anything we can do to make that more consistent, so that we don't have some counties being more unfair to farmers than other counties. And then anything we can do to help low-income customers. A lot of times, especially at farmers markets, there's some great programs for them to purchase fresh fruits and vegetables. However, sometimes those incentives aren't there for locally grown meat. So anything that could do to kind of help that incentive for a low-income consumer, so that their buying power for meat isn't just at Kroger with all that meat that's processed out west, maybe there's something we can do to help that. So I think I'm out of time.
Great, thanks. Cindy, that was really awesome, really packed with lots of great information. Thank you. If you don't mind, I'm gonna ask folks to hold questions until Brad has a chance to do his presentation. So Brad, would you like to start?
Yep, sure can. Let me get this up and going here. Okay, everybody see that, hopefully? Can you see that okay? All righty. Well, good. That was a great lead in, Cindy, to what we're going to talk about in terms of specialty crops. Specialty crops are a high income opportunity for a lot of our small farms. And I'm just going to talk about what specialty crop opportunities are out there and how it has and really hasn't impacted. Actually, the impact COVID has had on specialty crops has actually been very positive. Too bad it had to be a COVID epidemic that caused the spike in people wanting to buy from the farmer and locally grown and locally produced. But for the most part, our produce and specialty crop farmers are having a very good year despite the pandemic that we're in. But I'm a horticulture specialist with Ohio State University. I'm located in Southern Ohio, and that's my main area of specialization is high value specialty crops, because those of you familiar with Southern Ohio, we're in Appalachian Ohio, lots of small farms, and one way to keep the family farm going on these small acreage farms is to grow high value crops. We can't grow corn and soybeans and expect to support a family farm that's 10, 15, 25 acres. So high value crops that can gross up to $10, $15, $20,000 an acre. That's where I have put my research and education emphasis on the last 30 years of my career. That was my boys a long time ago. The one on the left, he's actually a sophomore, no, actually junior year now at Ohio State. And the other two, one's graduated and the other one's a senior in ag economics at Ohio State. But what are specialty crops? Really, like I said before, they're the only real crop we can do that can produce high income per almost square foot. We're not really talking acreage, but there are a lot of things that we need to be concerned about. One, like Cindy with her livestock, we have to develop the markets for our specialty crops. So there's not a ready-made market like our grain farmers and so forth. You just have to develop that market, then grow according to that market. Lots of inputs we have to remember before we get into specialty crops. Like I said, the marketing, this is all stoop labor, folks. We don't have mechanization for the most part with these crops anymore. And they just aren't developing mechanization. There's just none out there. Plus, we can't afford what is out there as small farmers. So still got to have a lot of kids like I did, or you got to have a strong back or a lot of people willing to work real hard and put in lots of hours of stoop labor in the high heat and high humidity. Some of these crops we can actually put in up to $10,000 an acre investment or more. That would be a hops planting, where you're growing hops for the microbrewing industry, a grape planting, an apple orchard, a blackberry planting. However, those can reap high returns after a little bit of a wait time. That's another thing with specialty crops. Your corn and soybeans we plant 90 to 100 days later, we're getting the harvest. With specialty crops, we may be looking at 3 years till we even get an income. So not only do we have a $10,000+ per acre investment, we also have to maintain that crop, and it could cost up to $5,000 an acre just to maintain it until we get into the harvest. So these are some of the things that, you know, if you're considering specialty crops or even into it and you're trying to maybe expand, we need to keep all this in mind. Then the weather always plays. gosh, this has been not only with the COVID pandemic, but the weather roller coaster we've been playing with. Too much rain, droughts, floods, corn just went down last week in some parts of the state from the storms, sweet corn, just all kinds of concerns with that. And then we have some marketing issues. You know, if there's a glut, you're going to have a lower price. But this year, thanks to the pandemic, I guess, market prices for the most part on specialty crops have been high, and the demand has been high. I think folks just don't want to go into the stores, so they're willing to come to a farmer's market or come to, like me and my family have a small 25-acre farm, and we just got a little open air market out front here. Folks drive up, they pick out their produce, throw their money in the honor system box if we're not around, and they take off. So lots of low social distance, a lot of social distancing, a lot of low input there. But these are just a few of the examples of specialty crop enterprises: vegetables, fruits, flowers, nursery, sod, seed, hops, herbs. Hemp is not in there, and hemp is a new crop that's come into Ohio in the past year. So hemp is not considered a specialty crop, but it is a future crop, I do believe. We're not quite there yet. So I'm just going to go through real quick what specialty crops are for us in Ohio. This type, this is actually what I cut my teeth on when I became a specialty crop grower with my own money back when I was 16. My family's actually, I'm a 4th generation vegetable farmer, but I started growing processing tomatoes and processing pickles for the Heinz plant up in Fremont, Ohio. And so this is the processing industry we have in Ohio, and it's very site specific. So like down here in Southern Ohio, we don't have a lot of processors. They process vegetables, so we are sort of, we can't take advantage of those opportunities. But in Northwest Ohio, we have a lot of pickle processors, tomato processors, cabbage processors, and there's a lot of opportunities for that. Not as high income opportunities as we have for retail and wholesale specialty crops, but still much better in this type of specialty crop operation than we'd have in corn and soybeans per se. So that's not going to hit most of us, but this is probably what's going to hit most of us, smaller acreage farms, is the wholesale fresh market production or the retail fresh market production. Just a few examples of some of my folks, how they coped with COVID this year. This is Nina Volkman. She's one of my farmers down in Mainville, Ohio, and she's a hop farmer. And so really, being in the field did not impact us too much for COVID. But as you can see, the brewers, this is who she sells, one of her many brewers she sells to, Valley Vineyards. And when the crop hit the brewer, there's where the COVID face mask and social distancing and everything had to come into play. But we did have some folks that employ a lot of people. We have some very large 2, 3, 5,000 acre vegetable farms in the state. And when they employ a lot of labor to do the harvesting and run the packing line, as you can see in the pictures here, very close distance, aren't they? So similar to what Cindy said with the meat processors, we also experienced that same thing in the fruit and vegetable industry this year, where you had a lot of people and you get a few people sick and they spread it real quick because they're working real close together. And that sort of put a little bit of a blip in some of our harvesting, some of our processing, some of our packaging, but not too bad. You know, you just isolate those folks, get them well, and then bring them back 2 weeks later. But it did cause a few hiccups in harvesting and processing when the harvest and the processing crews and the packaging crews had to be down. Numbers had to go down a little bit when people did end up getting sick. Probably for most of us, though, retail fresh market crops, this is what me and my family do because we just have a small farm. So we want to get the biggest dollar we can for our crops. So some of the opportunities we have with that, low volumes compared to wholesale and processing, but higher dollar return because we're that much closer to the consumer. So that'd be on-farm farm markets like me and my wife have here, just got a market wagon out front that we sell directly off the farm. A lot of community farmers markets. Ohio's very strong in that, so a lot of those. This CSA subscription farming has really went up this year with the pandemic. We used to have a 300-member CSA at our family back 10 years ago. Then we got out of it 4 years ago because the interest had waned. Now this year it just took off strong again. with retail, you have to be a people person. You got to want to talk. You can't be like my grandfather was not a retail. We kept him out in the back 40 because we didn't want him around customers. But you have to be happy. You got to be a people person. You got to be talking. You got to be, no matter how late you worked and how early you were awake, you got to be happy and smile the entire time. So you have to be a people person if you're going to enter this type of specialty crop marketing. And then another one we have, which is not quite the wholesale, but not quite the retail. I helped start the very first wholesale produce auction in Ohio back 30 years ago when I started with Extension. Now we have 16 produce auctions. So the picture on the bottom right was not this year, but you can see the COVID pandemic did impact our produce auctions because you have all these people gathered around the auctioneer, around the lot of produce, and it's auctioned off within 30 seconds. But you have all these people. So that was one thing that COVID did do for us this year with the produce auction industry. We had to make sure and encourage our buyers, social distancing, not to bring a lot of sightseers to the auction house. Almost every auction, though, was right on track. They start April 1, and I think a majority were a week or two late, but a majority of them hit that target date, and sales have been phenomenal at the produce auctions. The other one, these are some of my farmers from down around Wheelersburg, Scioto County, Ohio. The Furman family, they have a big orchard, but they go to 8 farmers markets a week. So as you can see, they had to change things up a little bit too with COVID. They're wearing face shields and face masks, just like all of us are having to do. But because you're in that close proximity talking and selling to all these people at the farmers market, we had to abide by all the COVID regulations and social distancing and so forth. But really, it wasn't that big of a deal for us, specialty crop farmers. But I just want to hit home again. Make sure you have all the things that you want to, your labor, your investments, your irrigation, all that. And then make sure your partners or your family are in line. If it's just the husband has this brainy idea, they want to grow produce and stoop over all the time and pick it, but the rest of the family's not quite into it, maybe you better get that set straight before you go and start investing in a specialty crop enterprise, because it is hard work. I mean, we raised our children that way. They didn't mind stooping over a 1,000-foot row picking strawberries, except once in a while when they're like 10 or 11, they'd say, "Dad, I'm getting a little dizzy from bending over so long." But that's how it is. You're bent over like this, stoop labor. I'm still doing it today, even at 50 some. I do it on my knees a lot more than bending over. But and then if you want to give up every summer holiday, become a specialty crop farmer, because Labor Day is a very laborious day as a specialty crop. I worked my tail off last weekend, and Memorial Day, 4th of July, every summer holiday, might as well just kiss goodbye if you're going to be a special, because you're making money. That's when people are spending. So that's the best way to blow off your summer, I guess. Irrigation, geez, I'm going to go through these real quick because I know we're getting to the end, but irrigation is important. If you don't have that on the farm, you probably better not think about growing specialty crops, because irrigation is just a source of crop insurance. And then there's not much machinery, but you might have to make your own machinery. Like I've built a lot of my own stuff. There is some available that you can purchase, but it's expensive and it takes a lot of time. Don't think you're going to get $20 an hour. It's more like $2 an hour if you're a vegetable crop farmer or a specialty crop farmer. You can probably make more money working at McDonald's or a restaurant or somewhere than being a specialty crop farmer, because you're always doing something. Then it comes down to that money thing again. You got to have money to invest and keep that operation going. So don't forget about all the resources that are available. You're very fortunate if you're from Ohio to have the 2 land grants. We have extension agents, we have specialists that can help out. We have field days like Cindy put on last night. So we have SBDC folks based out of my research farm at Piketon that can help people develop an ag business plan for you. And I would say, look at that. Even if you're going to add a new specialty crop, put that business plan together, how you're going to actually manage and market that crop and how it's going to impact you. So really, just to hit on COVID here for the last few minutes, and then we'll open her up for a few questions. But COVID did not stop agriculture. You know, everybody, some of those that aren't as close to agriculture thought, oh, you know, there's not going to be no farmers markets this year, and there's not going to be vegetable. It never stopped. We just kept on hammering. We're very fortunate in Ohio. In most states, agriculture was deemed an essential business. So none of the fertilizer companies shut down, none of the seed companies shut down. We farmers were able to be on the roads when everybody else was supposed to be home. We were able to go get supplies and haul livestock and drive tractors on the road and do all of our farming stuff. So really, me, as a farmer hat, I loved it. I didn't have to go nowhere. I was just here on my little piece of paradise. I didn't. Ohio State said I had to stay home and work. I said, fine, that's fine by me. But agriculture did not stop with COVID this year. Everybody kept on rolling. Our southern and western growers, though, they were impacted. Similar to what Cindy said, how livestock, you're talking, you know, a year, 2 years, 3 years out. With specialty crops, we're about 90 days out to 100 days out. And maybe even more so, because we'll have our bigger growers will have their restaurants and their wholesale distributors lined up with acreage, but it takes about 100 days to grow that crop. It varies. Radishes are quicker. But anyway, what hurt the southern and western growers was they already had crops in the ground planted for the restaurant industry. And then what happened? Restaurants shut down. So those restaurants did not buy the produce. So you may Google or heard some news reports, you know, farmers out there with big disking under the produce. Yes, they had to, because their buyers shut down and weren't going to use it. So that was schools, university, restaurants, all those that already had committed. Well, they had to back out on those orders. So that's the only thing that really got hurt. But by the time it hit us in March here in Midwest, we weren't really growing and had nothing in the ground per se yet. So it did not affect us by that means. But, you know, we had to wear the face masks. We had to practice good hygiene. All the stuff that we are already doing as farmers, because the Food Safety Modernization Act kicked in officially, I think, a year or two ago. So we've been gearing our farmers up to do all the PPE and all the sanitizing and disinfecting and everything of a produce farm. We've been training folks to do that for the last 10 years, and they were already up and doing it because it was a federal law. We have to. So that really we didn't have to kick up and do more sanitizing and PPE and all that. But I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. I don't know how many of you are specialty crop growers, but you can probably, I think you can review this later, or if you want to, you can get this information from me. But we as Ohio State and other universities put together a lot of fact sheets and information on how to prep your farm, and in different scenarios, produce auctions, farmers markets, and so forth. So I'm not going to go through all of this, but it is available to you specialty crop farmers that may need a little bit of help. The biggest thing, though, was, and we just launched this, agritainment is a big thing in Ohio. Pumpkin picking, apple picking. So we, in order to open our farms up to those customers, we had to get health department approval at the county level and prove to them that we had already, you know, figured out social distancing and the hand sanitizing. And, you know, if you ever drove those little hay rides around the farm, all the stuff we have to do, we have to sanitize the entire hay ride in between customers. Even on our small farm, you know, we have a pick your own pumpkin operation. So now we have to sanitize the wagons and the clippers in between each family. So we have all these standard practices, but a lot of it's basic common sense stuff. But you should already be up on this with the Food Safety Modernization Act. But the big thing is food does not really transmit the virus. No data shows that it does transmit by food, at least the last I heard. So that is a good thing for us agricultural. So this is just some of the feedback the growers have been giving me. Specialty crop growers hope this high demand stays. Even that we hope the COVID is over, but we hope the high demand and hope it brought people back to purchasing direct from the farmer. And really, there hasn't been any bad things. Our farmers, the only bad thing is my farmers are tired, they're working so hard, and they don't have enough produce because the demand's so high. So it's been a great year to be a specialty crop farmer, and we hope we get through this fall crop season. And this is the first big weekend of pumpkin picking and fall agritainment, and it's looking pretty good. The farmers have done a great job. So there's some of our information that I skimmed through real quick, but if you want to delve into it some more, you can see our fact sheets on our produce safety.osu.edu COVID-19 resources. And
Great,
there's my
thank you.
contact information if you want to get a hold of me.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Brad. And thank you, Cindy. In fact, Cindy, would you also put your contact info in the chat if you wouldn't mind? Because there are some very specific questions around regulations, which we're not going to be able to get into. So if Carol, if you wanted to reach out to Cindy. We actually are a little over time, but I did want to ask one question that sort of segues into our where do we go from here? I'm hearing from Brad, and by the way, I really appreciate the fact that you're both active farmers as well as extension agents. So I'm sure you make awesome extension agents. I'm wondering, some of the conversation that we've had throughout this conference has been around the challenges of going from kind of a global food system to a local food system, and one of the main ones being distribution, kind of all the middle people. And Cindy, you mentioned that a little bit. Brad, just a little bit in terms of some produce suppliers who are used to selling to larger markets or larger consumers. I wonder, could you, if just, and this, we only have like one or a couple quick minutes, maybe one thing that individuals who are concerned about local food might do, either at the, by talking to policymakers or the way they do their shopping, one thing they might do to spur the next stage of the local food system. And then is there anything that Ohio State and Central State are doing to really think about this crunch at the processing, delivery, aggregation, marketing, just all the stuff also that Terry was talking about in terms of farmers having some support at that middle level. So it's a complicated question. I know you've been thinking about it, Cindy, at least part of that. So maybe just a few minutes on what you think individuals and institutions can do to move us forward as a community.
I think one of the things that I would encourage, as far as when you think about meat processing, and this was something that was, when you look at the states where we have processing that's happening and we don't have it happening in Ohio, there's some non-agricultural regulations that affect people that are in processing. So specifically workmen's compensation rules and regulations. When you get into processing, some of those type of rules become, you no longer have an agriculture exemption. So there's certain things that farmers do that we have an agriculture exemption. However, for processors, OSHA regulations, as well as some of the workmen's compensation. So any of those that are very state specific that Ohio maybe has more rigorous than other states, it's looking at, because we don't want to have any bad situations for our workers, but are there some things that can maybe be done as far as subsidies or things to help promote agricultural processing, to help them maybe with some of those added costs that they have to meet those regulations. So I think it's really looking at that fairness of the regulations, so that it's fair to the worker, fair to the consumer, but also fair to the person who's doing the investment in order to have that business, because it does affect agriculture. And this isn't just in meat processing, but also when you start looking into food processing. Like Brad talked about, we used to have a lot of like tomato processors in Ohio and specialty crop processors, and we just don't have those anymore. So a lot of our product actually leaves Ohio to go be processed someplace else. So I think, there's maybe some questions there that need to be looked at to see what we can do. And
Great answer, Cindy. Thank you. So yeah, and I think again, it wouldn't be necessarily an obvious thing for folks to recognize as an issue. So thank you for raising that. How about you, Brad? What would you suggest policy-wise, or what's Extension doing, or how we as consumers and concerned citizens can be involved?
I would say probably just as a consumer, try to educate yourself about farming. Too many people don't understand, you know, they see organic at the Kroger store, but that organic in Mexico is different than the organic in Chile, which is different than the organic in the US. I've been in Mexico, I've been in packing sheds. They're packing one regular tomato, and then they have to pack for an organic line, and they just pull the boxes off and it's the exact same tomato. They don't have the regulations we do here in the US. So maybe keep that in mind. Not all organics is the same. And, you know, support your organic farmers, those poor farmers. I got a lot of organic buddies. I am not organic because I can't afford it, and I don't like to spray that much. But my organic farmers, just here in Ohio, for some reason, I've served on several committees trying to fix this. The consumer will not pay, for the most part, our poor organic farmers what they should get. If I'm getting $6 a dozen for my sweet corn, an organic farmer should at least be getting $12 a dozen, because their yields are cut, their pesticide costs are higher, their seed costs are higher. I love organic farmers, and I think it's a great industry. Now you go to other states, East Coast, California, their organic farmers are supplemented and supported very well by the consumer. But here in the Midwest, I would love to see that increased, and I don't know how to do it. I voice my concern everywhere I can, but I'm just a little tiny mute person.
I really appreciate you voicing it here too. And thanks everyone. I'm sorry that we didn't get around to questions, but really grateful to Cindy and Brad. Those were fabulous presentations, and thank you for your service. It's really, extension services are really amazing resources, and I hope folks take advantage of them.